Ukraine is on a diplomatic offensive to get the West to remove its own self-imposed red lines, saying they need permission, and they need it now in order to positively affect the situation on the ground and Russia's ability to continue the war. Now, joining us here to discuss is Elisabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Hello, good evening.
Good evening.
And Ivana Stradner, Research Fellow at Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. Hello, Ivana. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Now, I'd like to start off with just one question from the U.S. perspective, because as we see, Dmytro Kuleba has gone to Brussels, and he's actually begging his European partners to somehow influence the situation in the United States. And I'd like you both to sound off on this. Where do we think the Biden administration is currently with the incursion into Kursk? Do they still believe that this is escalatory and maybe a step towards World War III, or are they starting to reevaluate these self-imposed, as I've sort of described it, red lines? And let's start with you, Elisabeth.
Well, it doesn't really matter what the Biden administration thinks at this point, because the incursion is already taking place, and it would be ridiculous for the Biden administration, or indeed any other Western government, to say, well, we shouldn't be doing that. So,
but they need to use the use of the long-range weapons. The Institute for the Study of War has identified 280 targets which are in range of ATACMS right now on the territory of Ukraine. So this seems to be a very desperate measure for President Zelensky.
Correct. And I think what the Ukrainians did so brilliantly with this incursion was that they essentially asked for forgiveness rather than permission, which is always a good strategy if you want to do something that you don't think your partners will agree with you about. And so the Ukrainians conducted this incursion, launched this incursion. It's going pretty well. And rather than having waited for permission from the Biden administration and other Western governments, they essentially are now saying afterwards, well, sorry about that, but now we are doing it. And I think what is significant, though, is that it's actually hasn't proven as disastrous as Western governments had worried about. Disastrous in terms of Russian escalation, and that's what we've been fearing all along. What the West has been fearing all along, that Ukrainian attacks on Russia would lead to very dangerous escalation. That hasn't happened this time. So Ukraine has essentially proven certain Western governments wrong, and it may lead to a reevaluation of the red lines that you mentioned earlier.
Ivana, your thoughts?
So the Biden administration has a long history of actually fearing escalation. So as Elisabeth just explained, the situation related to the Kursk, but also not only that, actually, I also watch the Russian news, and Putin said basically that after Kursk, there is no negotiations possible. Second thing is Russia has promised to clarify its nuclear doctrine. And let's not forget it, Putin is not a military guy. He's a KGB intel guy. He understands very well what resonates with Washington, that policymakers here, they fear escalation, they fear nuclear threats. And Putin, that's part of his psychological games that he has been playing against the West, when in fact, Putin's decision-making process is very different. Whatever the Biden administration does or says, it is not going to impact already his strategy on Ukraine. But however, he also understands very well by playing those psychological games against the West, that actually helps the West to appease him even further, not to allow Ukraine to defend itself properly and finally to win.
Elisabeth, you said that they kept this secret from their U.S. partners and other European partners. We saw the counteroffensive last year in which they shared that information, what they were going to do in the counteroffensive, and it utterly failed. But this looks very different, and because they kept it so secret. So it's also been said that the presidential candidates and Joe Biden will be informed of this 4-point victory plan and exactly what they want to achieve. Is this a good idea to disclose this information with both presidential candidates? One of them may not make it. One of them will not make it, for sure.
Yes, there are two risks, I think, from a Ukrainian perspective when it comes to informing Western allies. One is that the Western allies will say, well, that's not a good idea, we won't support you. The second risk is that somebody along that communication chain will decide to tell somebody else, even though it's obviously highly classified information. But anyway, there is a risk that that information ends up in the wrong hands and that the surprise element is then gone. And clearly that's what you, those two things are two really crucial aspects that the Ukrainians have been worrying about and decided that they would do it differently. So I think when it comes to informing the presidential candidates, the Ukrainians will do it with those two considerations in mind. And I will be curious to see, in fact, I don't think we will ever know for sure, but I would be very curious to know whether the Ukrainians decide to tell the presidential candidates and the the running mates all the aspects of what they are planning to do, or just certain aspects of it.
Ivana, since they didn't tell their Western partners, their allies, of this incursion or their planned incursion, what about the use of Western weapons to maybe attack some of those targets inside of Russia? Maybe they should use them and surprise their Western partners in their use.
Indeed, as a matter of fact, that's precisely what Russia is saying, that no matter what the United States says and impose certain restrictions, they believe that the United States and Ukraine, they're just bluffing, and the United States is actually supporting Ukraine. So I always like to say, if actually Putin believes that, and we should just literally play along those lines and allow Ukraine to use the weapons and to hit Russia where it hurts most, because it's Russia that escalated first. And as I said multiple times in your show, this war, in Putin's view, it's not only against Ukraine. Putin is waging war against NATO, and it's definitely high time, for the West, especially Washington, to stop pretending that this is not influencing and that this is not also having impact on the West. They do understand why the Biden administration fears certain escalation, especially around the elections times here, and all possibilities that Russia can do in terms of sabotage and doing different influence operations inside the country to harm Washington. But nevertheless, allowing Ukraine to hit the targets inside Russia is not going to change the calculus for Putin.
Okay, well, Elisabeth Braw and Ivana Stradner, thank you very much for joining us tonight and explaining your thoughts. We very much appreciate it. Thank you to you both. And that concludes this edition of World News Tonight. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next time, and good night.